Well, welcome to Buzzercott. I'm Iain Butler. I head up the R&D tax credits team within the business. And we've been running a few of these webinars throughout the year, and this is the second one that we've run. So the first one we looked at record keeping and subcontractors. But we thought that now would be a good time to have a look at big data. I mean, we see this all the time at the moment. It's a sort of hot topic, whether it's looking at health data and trying to analyze what's going on with coronavirus and various other things, or whether it's government departments trying to use analytics to help their operations, or businesses trying to get to grips with complex operations. It seems to be everywhere, and everybody's making use of it to one level or another. And obviously some people are making better use of it than others, and it's not easy to get the systems to work. But I think the key thing we have got at the moment is a lot of companies are looking, can we claim R&D tax credits for this work? And we have seen there's inquiries out there and challenges from revenue. So what we thought we would go through today is to try and give you the background and information to understand, firstly, how do you distinguish eligible activity from ineligible activity? And my colleague Luke Barnbrook will be running through that section of the presentation. I mean, he's been involved in modelling himself, so has some hands-on experience of actually what it's like to try and process data, complex data sets. Then I'll be going through a couple of other areas. One of them looking at the implementation of machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's where we see the inquiries and where the problems are coming through from revenue. And then finally, we're going to move on to the costs, because this is one area that I think it's an element of frustration as to what can be claimed, and there's a lack of clarity. But also, I think it's useful just to run through why revenue have some concerns in this area. And then finally, we'll finish off with a Q&A session. But to start with, I will hand over to Luke, who will give a brief introduction of the R&D tax scheme for those who might not be familiar with it, just to sort of break down what it's all about, and then he'll move on to looking at the eligible activities.
Thanks, Iain. Yeah, so before we go into the main details of the presentation, as Iain just said, it's probably worthwhile to give a brief overview of the R&D tax credit scheme, what it actually means to your business, and the type of benefit it can generate for you. So firstly, and you're probably already aware of this, but the R&D tax credit scheme is a great way to generate cash. So typically, a successful claim will pay out within 28 days of being submitted. This can be put straight back into the business and reinvested in R&D. And this type of support can be really important for some businesses. Particularly if your development work is complicated and you can't commercialize the products through the feasibility and development phases, the R&D tax credit scheme can really help you with your cash flow there. So what benefit will the scheme actually generate for you? So the scheme for SME businesses is very generous, and for loss-making businesses, a claim can release 33% of the qualifying spend as cash. And in a lot of cases, this can be a really significant amount. So for a lot of companies undertaking big data analytic projects, there are often pretty significant costs around getting the right staff, the right data scientists, and the software engineers, and as well as subcontractors and software licenses. So all of these costs can be claimable under the scheme. And also, as the government reopens consultation about the scheme, we actually may see the scope of qualifying costs change to include things like hosting costs. And then for large companies, we have the RDET scheme, and that gives an above-the-line taxable credit equal to 13% of the qualifying spend. So both schemes are lucrative, and really this is something businesses should be factoring into their planning. It will allow businesses to invest in riskier innovation and trialing new technologies. So businesses can look at new AI and machine learning technologies that haven't been applied in their sector, and they can spend time experimenting with that and actually proving that they can work. And as such, it's unsurprising that this type of investment, investing in R&D has actually been shown to increase company turnover and can actually help increase the chances of becoming a listed enterprise. So as I highlighted a minute ago, HMRC is still working to their 28-day turnaround. It's worth noting that you may recently have seen some delays in the benefit being paid out. That's down to COVID restrictions and things moving a bit slower with HMRC staff all working from home again. But generally, the R&D tax credit scheme will be quickly accessible, which is good news for your business. So the scheme is proven to work, and it's a great way to ensure cash flow while undertaking development. And it can clearly boost innovation capability at the company level as well as the sector level. However, it's very important to not cut corners when preparing a claim, and that's for a number of reasons. So if there are errors in your claim that can result in a delay in the benefit, and you may actually have to go back and revisit part of your claim and potentially have to engage with other advisors to assist with doing that, which is all costly and it, it just delays the time till you actually get the cash to put back into the business. But more importantly, or more seriously than that, HMRC can also start an inquiry into your R&D claim, even after it's been processed with money paid into your bank account. And businesses have actually been asked to pay back really significant amounts, which has actually caused big issues with the viability of the business and sometimes actually raised problems with future funding rounds or acquisitions when investors carry out due diligence into businesses and identify R&D claims that have been submitted with errors. Okay, so that was just a brief overview of the scheme. So if we jump across to the next slide, we can start discussing some of the specific challenges around claiming big data analytics projects. So I'll start by discussing distinguishing statistical strategy from eligible R&D activity. So as Iain said earlier, we do work with a number of clients who successfully claim R&D tax credits for big data analytic projects. However, what we find is because so much of the activity involved in data analytics, like the statistical strategy and undertaking the research and producing the modelling, is so inherently complex, one of the issues our clients have when preparing their claim is separating out the eligible activity from challenging non-qualifying activity. And in particular, this could be an issue for distinguishing pure mathematics, which is not recognised as science by HMRC in and of itself, from technological development and understanding how a project which entails both should be presented to HMRC in an R&D report. And this can be difficult to do, and because there are significant differences in the way companies use big data with lots of nuances, it's not always clear-cut what HMRC wants to see in an R&D report for an eligible project, and there isn't really a one-size-fits-all template we could just apply. So when you are preparing your claim, what can you do to make sure you're only claiming activity which qualifies? So it's probably worth stepping back a bit and looking at what HMRC considered to be science and technology that qualifies for R&D relief, because they do make some specific exclusions and provide some definitions which can be a really useful starting point. And it's probably always worth consulting with the legislation when you're thinking about making a claim. And in a lot of instances, it will be fairly intuitive to understand when something fits within the HMRC definitions. But where things do become less clear, you should definitely consult with an advisor, because HMRC have recently taken quite a strong position where claimants have misunderstood the legislation and the relevant definitions. So according to the definitions used by HMRC, which are taken from the OECD, science is a systematic study of the nature and behaviour of the physical and material universe, and technology is a practical application of scientific principles and knowledge. So when revenue say R&D for tax purposes takes place when a project seeks an advance in science and technology, this is a definition they've applied to decide if something is considered science and technology. And then on top of these definitions, HMRC have set out their own additional carve-outs, which explicitly rule out quite a lot of activity. And this is where things can possibly become a bit ambiguous, and navigating the rules isn't as straightforward. So, for instance, when we look at mathematics and economics, HMRC have made it very clear that advances in mathematics in and of themselves are not considered science unless they're advances in representing the nature and behaviour of the physical and material universe. And this is where things get tricky, because we often see that where our clients are working on computer science and big data analytics projects, maths and sometimes econometrics are really intrinsically tied up with what they're doing. It's also worth noting that HMRC have ruled out the social sciences, so So, for example, companies seeking to solve uncertainties around population trends and unemployment issues won't have an R&D claim in virtue of researching these issues. So if a company is using big data analytics to research a social science subject matter, we could only really claim the costs if there was some innovation in the technology being used. So HMRC are going to expect claimants to understand all of these exclusions and the definitions, and they'll also want to see this demonstrated in the R&D reports. And this has presented issues for claimants, and recently there was a tribunal for a company called AHK Recruitment, and one of the big issues that HMRC flagged was continued reference to areas of research that they don't consider science and technology, and ultimately referencing these parts of their project just confused revenue as to why it was a valid claim at all. And Iain will talk more about this tribunal later on and go into the details. So it's probably worth noting that even if your project does entail significant amounts of mathematical work, there is still potential for a valid claim. It's just going to require more work separating out the eligible aspects and understanding how the mathematics works can be tied back into the eligible activity. So there are two things you need to do to make this work, and you should be looking at your eligibility assessments and your technical descriptions. So the first thing you need to do is make your thorough eligibility assessment, and this is where you should be really working with a competent advisor who can help dig into the technical work so you can understand what's been developed and how it fits within the R&D legislation. and as every project is different, it's only really through having these discussions that the relevant R&D can be pulled out. And often we find when speaking with clients, it's necessary to go into quite a lot of detail regarding things like the data that requires processing for the analytics tools, and where the data is unusually complex. Often you'll have to have a novel data management system with clever modeling to achieve the speed and performance in your technology platform. So by going into the details, we can actually work out what can go into the claim, what should be excluded, and often we can then link back in what might seem like routine data processing and link it back into the actual eligible activity that's been claimed. So next, you really need to think carefully about how you present your project to HMRC, because often legitimate projects are challenged by HMRC over the way the technical descriptions have been prepared. So if your project does entail lots of mathematics, then this needs to be framed in relation to the technical aspects of your development. For instance, where you're building things like advanced statistical analysis, it'd be sensible to focus on the associated technology, like any algorithms or machine learning techniques that have been developed to support the analysis of complex data. Or if you're having challenges with your statistical models, you can focus on things like developing certain AI capabilities that can address these issues and overcome those problems. So really, what we're getting at is that when you're presenting an eligible project to HMRC, it needs to be clear that the company have sought advances that in some way gone beyond existing technical capability within a relevant field of science and technology. And for the claim to be successful, you need to show the underlying technology behind any improvements and developments. And this is something we can help you do by digging down into your project and checking that you're only claiming eligible activity. And we can then help you frame the project in a way suitable for submission. So if we jump across to the next slide, we can start looking at some examples, and we could apply this to some actual, real life examples. So if we consider some projects within fintech and the financial services that could be seeking to, model things like the financial markets or understand investor behavior, or seeking to automate certain banking processes, it is inevitable that doing this work is going to entail statistical methods and mathematical techniques. So, that could be things like regression models or quadratic optimization, or just actually using statistical analysis to interpret the results that you're modeling. And often many of the challenges facing developing these predictive modeling projects will actually be in the mathematical techniques as well as in computer science. So that could be developing a strategy that detects relationships in complex data, or estimating covariance, or seeking to control for reverse causality. So it's very typical for claimants to have to develop their own proprietary statistical modeling for their projects. And even though this is very complex work in its own right, within the HMRC rules, this type of mathematical development can't be claimed. However, where it can be claimed is where it links back into the building of advanced technology, where, for instance, you could be building things like like a simulation environment that depends on statistical assumptions to run scenarios and train machine learning agents. And these are the type of distinctions we look for. And in this way, we can actually turn a project on its head and focus in on the eligible parts. So it's always worth speaking to an advisor about your data analytics projects, because we can look at it from a different perspective and help you identify any eligible R&D. For instance, you often find when speaking to clients that when they are developing algorithms, they almost always have issues when trying to apply the concept onto real hardware, particularly when there are large amounts of data that need to be screened and stored within quick timeframes, or there's lots of different information traveling from all over the world. And in this instance, often companies have to find innovative solutions to achieve resilience in the hardware and guarantee performance. So that could be things like building a network of servers designed specifically for the complex data, or developing caching or multi-threading techniques that allow your system to perform. But the point is really that as the data becomes more complicated, performance issues tend to arise, and then things quickly become very challenging and require novel technical solutions that go beyond just statistical strategy. And even if you are just using standard algorithms, when you apply that to the new and complicated data sets, often that can be the start of the R&D project, where you identify various issues, and this could be around things like sensitivity and overfitting. And you need to solve them through redeveloping the technology. So it's really important to keep these distinctions in mind when presenting the eligible project to HMRC. So it's the technical implementation that's important. And by focusing it this way around, it's possible to actually expand the scope and the value of the R&D claim. So, always explain your modeling challenges in the context of creating in-house software. And often we find businesses working on big data analytics projects have created novel simulation environments and data manipulation capabilities with things like machine learning. They could be good examples to present to HMRC. And the mathematical part shouldn't just be ignored, because they are an important part of the project, for creating and testing the technology. But they should always be dropped in with some examples of how they're connected with the technological advances, because focusing too much on mathematics will eventually just cause issues with HMRC, because they have made their position very clear. But if you at Buzzcott, we do actually have a proven and versatile claims preparation methodology. And by speaking with your technical team and carefully reviewing the projects and assessing the eligibility, we can pick out the right parts, and we can produce robust technical documentation with clear reference to the relevant legislation. And this could be suitable for HMRC, and it could be submitted with minimal risk. So I'm now going to pass back to Iain, who's going to discuss claiming AI and machine learning.
Okay, thank you, Luke. One thing I did suddenly realise I forgot to mention: if you want to ask any questions as we're going along, just send them through into the chat channel, and we'll be able to answer them in the Q&A. But as Luke said, I'm going to sort of look at this in a little bit more detail and focus on two areas: machine learning and artificial intelligence. And these are areas that there's a lot of talk about. There's lots of articles, presentations about where they're being used and what amazing things they can do. And this has sort of prompted a concern with revenue as to, are people just copying what other companies are doing, or are they actually moving the technology forward? And I think some companies feel that revenue can be taking quite an extreme view in this space, but what they're trying to do is determine whether the projects are eligible. So what you have to try and consider is, if you're applying public available techniques such as, say, natural language processing, HMRC might come and ask you, have you actually improved or enhanced that technique? That in itself can be quite difficult to go through and understand. So the key thing you need to be doing is trying to set the baseline and actually saying, where are the gaps? Where are the weaknesses with the current applications of the technique you're talking about? And are you bringing different techniques together to try and get around these problems? And to build up the argument as to why taking what's in the public domain and just applying that is not going to give you the solution you need. Machine learning, I think, has caused even more issues just simply around the naming of it and what it's about. So revenue look at this and think, well, surely that's just a machine and it's an engine technology that if you apply the standard learning process with supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and then reinforcement, aren't you just going to get to the answer you want? Is it not just maybe a complex problem to go through, but it's not a technological uncertainty? So you can sort of see where revenue are coming from, and it really is inherent on the applicants making the submission to say, what are the gaps and what are the differences? And this allows you to highlight those advances and uncertainties. And I think this is why we've seen quite a lot of challenge in this particular area, because a lot of the time companies are talking about the functions and features and what they want to do, rather than how they've moved the technology forward, what challenges they faced at a technical level, rather than at a functional level. So I guess the best way to see what this actually means in reality is then to have a look at an inquiry itself. So on the next slide, we're going to have a look at the tribunal case and just run through what was it that revenue dug into and challenged and tried to understand. So I think these are the key areas that come out when you read the tribunal. The first one really is around, what does readily deducible mean? And if the technology is readily deducible, you can't claim that work. But what revenue are really looking for here is, can you plan from day one and say, I know the steps I need to go through to actually achieve this. And yes, it might take time, it might entail using different resources, but it's more of a complex project than being technologically challenging. The other area that revenue do pick up on is if you talk about the functions and features and you're talking about maybe automating manual processes, revenue immediately will dig into that and say, no, that's not qualifying. That's codifying knowledge. It's not advancing capabilities. So you really have to think about how you present that idea of it being readily deducible. But it also then comes down to, well, does it actually amount to an advance, or are you just copying and adapting what's already there? And revenue will then start to wonder and want to understand, do you understand where that core platform technology is used? Have you looked at it? Have you gone away and looked at how maybe competitors or others in the field are using it? And have you gone beyond adaptation and tweaking or configuration in what you're doing? And I think where that then really comes out is in the tribunal, that both the judge and the HMRC put very strong emphasis on the competent professional. Are they really experienced in that core technology? So you might be experienced, say, in financial software and how you manage the software systems within a fintech business or a financial type aspects of your business. But do you have the depth of experience to determine whether the AI or the machine learning that you're using and you're making an advance in that area? And I think this is what the judge then takes a little bit further, and it seemed quite an extreme view, but they were looking for, had the person been involved in research? Have they gone to universities to look at the type of state-of-the-art work that's taking place? But I think what you're having to do there is to show the competent professional is an expert in the field, and the field being machine learning, artificial intelligence, and big data, as opposed to more generally in terms of IT infrastructure and IT systems. Revenue also were quite keen that the team who actually look at making the eligibility assessments were the team that were involved in the project. Now, this is one area that we see a lot of problems with, because IT staff do move around a lot, and you may bring in contractors, you may bring in staff on a temporary basis to try and help out with the project. So quite often by the end of the project where you're coming to make the eligibility assessments, the key people are not there anymore. So you need to start thinking as you're going through your projects, do I have enough records and have I got enough information that if there is an inquiry at a later date, we can actually answer the type of questions we might expect from revenue? And this is where we work with companies. We try and set up the claim process to look at these sort of issues. So we look at the records that are being kept. We challenge the competent professional and make sure they're comfortable with that assessment. If the competent professional isn't really comfortable with it, and I think this sort of came across a bit in the tribunal, then your whole case just falls apart in front of revenue, or in the worst case, in front of a judge. But you're needing to be comfortable. You understand the rules. You understand the boundary between eligible and ineligible work. And it's an area we've seen a lot of challenge, and we're helping companies with questions and inquiries that they get. So this is sort of going through more around the eligibility side of it. Luke's gone through how you make those differentiations. But the next step we're going to look at is, now let's just flip over and have a look at the costing side of things. Because again, there are some unique factors that come into this type of project. And I think there's some legacy issues as well with the scheme and when it was set up. So we got the qualifying costs. What can we claim? Well, in the legislation, it talks about software licenses, but it doesn't allow costs such as rental. So where do you stand if you've got a big data project? Well, software or a software license really is paying for access to the software, allowing you to use it. And SaaS type payments quite often fall within that definition, that maybe instead of paying a yearly license, you're paying on a monthly fee, you're paying on a seat basis, but eventually you really are paying to access that software. If you got past platform and service type payments, it's starting to get a bit less clear, because that could be somewhere between the two. And I think, unfortunately, when the guidance was written, we are going back to when these types of concepts hadn't really matured or were in common usage, and in a way it doesn't really fit with that. But if we go on to the next slide, the real problems happen when you then come on to hosting. So clearly hosting is different. It's talking about paying for access of effectively memory space on a physical server. And the only thing you can really say that's equivalent to is a rental payment. And revenue are clear. They don't accept hosting costs as being qualifying costs purely on this basis. And we do see companies getting into a muddle with this, and particularly as costs such as AWS or Azure are now becoming significant, you can end up with quite a big chunk of your outgoing expenditures around the business and not being claimable. But in other areas, again, the scheme's not really keeping up with the way businesses are run. So internet access, telephony, that's excluded. Although electricity, gas, water would be claimable, we're sort of not keeping up with what most companies would now consider as their core utilities. But the final area really that is very tricky is data licenses. What are they? Are they payments for software? Are they effectively a payment for access to data? It's quite difficult to fit them in with what the guidance says, particularly if they call the name license associated with them. So again, this is a very tricky area, and costs end up being excluded. Maybe there are ways to try and consider they could be included, because you need to look at what the underlying nature of the payment relates to. That it could be actually for an API that's allowing you access to the data. So what's all this ended up as is we've had a recent consultation where companies put in representations to say whether they felt these type of costs should be claimable, and this was included in the Conservative manifesto for the last election. So that's gone through, it's been looked at. I think in general, I'm not getting much of a positive feedback from revenue at the moment on that. But we've then, literally since I wrote this slide, we've had the consultation come out of the budget. And again, this has been raised. Is the definition of qualifying spend broad enough for the way that modern businesses are run? And if we expand it and allow more costs in, will it encourage more R&D? So as well as just helping companies through the claim, we also try and help you to understand what you can do to input into HMRC consultations and try and engage to get the scheme working in the best way tech businesses, for FS businesses, all those type of companies that are working in big data. So, I mean, the first thing is, as today is about, is getting training and understanding and up to date with what's going on. And working with an advisor is always a useful way to get to know what the latest changes, new pieces of legislation are. But the main thing we do try to encourage, and we're going to be doing roundtables to try and work on this even further, is getting engagement with those HMRC consultations, especially from the smaller businesses. The large companies know how to pull the levers and make things work the way they want it. Small businesses on their own have less say and less voice, but there are so many small businesses that they should be getting their voice heard by revenue, and they should come through clearly in the consultation. So we're trying to make sure this happens, so you understand how to respond to the consultation, how you can work with maybe an advisor to provide your responses. But the key thing is we want the scheme to work for everybody, and we want it to work for modern businesses with modern qualifying costs, which are more around the SaaS and the hosting type operations that are run now.